Cambridge Tech Level 3, Unit 4, Final PowerPoint, all the systems for anatomy and physiology. I'm going to go through all the main points that you should remember and should have revised for your exam. Firstly, we have the cardiovascular system. We must know the difference between a red blood cell and a white blood cell. The names, for example, erythrocytes, where they are made in the bone marrow, and their job to carry oxygen. White blood cells, you have lymphocytes, neutrophils and monocytes, and you must know the difference between all three of them. We then move on to plasma, which is the largest component of blood. It's really clear compared to the actual colour of blood, and it carries platelets, red and white cells and proteins. You must know the main functions of blood. Its jobs being to transport, to temperature regulate, it exchanges materials and tissues, it's infection prevention, and it's involved in blood clotting. You should know how to label the heart. Remember the key points. So the atrium is the first part that you walk into, an atrium of a hall, and ventricles are the same shape as the letter V. Remember, superior is on top. So the superior vena cava is on top and the inferior vena cava is below. The tricuspid valve is on the right hand side of the heart. And remember that when you look at the heart, you have to flip it around. So the right is on the left and the left is on the right. So you need to be aware of valves. You have tricuspid valve, bicuspid, and the aortic semilunar valve. It's an opening between the atria and the ventricles with a one-way valve, which allows the blood to move down, but then the valve's closed to prevent the blood going back up. We have the tricuspid valve, right-hand side. Blood flows from the right atrium into the right ventricle. Then we have the bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve, which is on the left-hand side, and this allows blood to flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle. We have the semilunar valves, and blood is allowed to flow out of the heart but not back into the ventricles when they relax again, as the exit is guarded by these semilunar valves. You need to be fully aware that the heart is a double pump. The right hand side receives oxygen poor blood from the body, and the left hand side receives oxygenated blood returning from the lungs and pumps this blood throughout the body to supply oxygen and nutrients to the body. With every beat, the heart drives arterial blood through the body and it draws venous blood back towards itself. You need to be aware of which side of the heart does what. Now, this question has appeared quite a lot in exam papers at the moment, and atrial fibrillation is on the increase due to COVID-19. You need to be aware of how the heart is actually controlled. The heart may actually be in good working order, but the electrics of the heart are not working very well. Then this can affect the rhythm of the heart. So we have the control and regulation of the heart. And we have the SA node first of all, and this is the pacemaker of the heart. It's really important not to mix this up with the AV node. You need to have a look on the diagram to understand where the SA node is, and it sets the rhythm of the heart. Then we move on to the AV node. Again, pay attention to where this is because you may be expected to label it in an exam. It delays the electrical impulses it receives from the SA node, which allows the blood to empty out of the atria into the ventricles. And then we have the Purkinje fibers. And if you have a little look, you should be able to see on here the bundles, the Purkinje fibers at the bottom there. And these are fine cardiac fibers, and they transmit impulses from the AV node to the ventricles. Please make sure you're aware of their jobs and their roles. We have an ECG here. You need to know what the waves represent. So for example, if you have a look at this ECG in front of you, the P wave at the beginning shows atrial contraction. The Q, R and S waves show ventricular contraction. So there's three of them, Q, R and S. And then as we move down, the T wave shows the ventricles relaxing, which is diastole. Having a quick look at the malfunctions of the heart, we can see that you could relate it back to angina, for example, where you are breathlessness, nausea, dizziness and chest pain. It can be quite similar to heart attack. A heart attack is myocardial infarction, so you could have lightheadedness, feeling weak, sweating, pain that can radiate from the jaw, neck and back. And this is caused by the walls of the arteries becoming blocked with fatty deposits. If they get completely blocked, then this is when it can actually cause a heart attack. So what can cause angina and a heart attack? It can be your age. Older people tend to have a higher risk of having a heart attack than someone younger. Your genes, it might run in the family. Gender, males tend to have more heart attacks than females. If you're a smoker or you drink a lot, you may be more prone to a heart attack. So how is it monitored? You could have blood tests, ECG machine, or you might be asked to make lifestyle changes. Medication, you could have nitrates, statins, ACE inhibitors, and surgical, you could have an angioplasty where a balloon is put into the artery, or a coronary bypass. Make sure you know the difference between them both, please. Quickly move on to hypertension. This is high blood pressure. So think about something being hyper, it's quite high. Hypertension is high blood pressure over 120/80. It's usually a little bit more higher than that. Biological explanation is if your systolic and diastolic is so your contraction and your relaxation is too high, it can damage the blood vessels. It's caused by age, family history, lack of exercise, stress, overweight, smoking and drinking. It can cause kidney disease, diabetes and hormone problems. It can be monitored by blood pressure, changing lifestyle, medication, so ACE inhibitors, which actually lower the heart rate. Beta blockers as well can help lower and stabilise the heart rate. And it can lead to an increased risk of coronary heart disease, strokes and kidney disease. We now move on to the role of the lymphatic system. It's a drainage and filtration system. It removes excess fluids from body tissues. It absorbs fatty acids and transports fat into the bloodstream to be absorbed by the smaller intestine. It produces white blood cells, which in turn produce antibodies. Lymph is basically plasma. It's a colourless fluid containing white blood cells which bathes the tissues and drains through the lymphatic system into the bloodstream. Once plasma is in the bloodstream, it turns to lymph. You should remember that the lymphatic system is part of the circulatory and immune systems, and it carries clear fluid from the tissues back to the heart. About 10% of the plasma in blood leaks through the capillaries, and this is tissue fluid. It carries glucose to cells. Most is reabsorbed into blood vessels, and a few litres are drained away towards the heart by the lymphatic system. It also has an important role in the immune system. You really need to be aware of the 3 blood proteins and their roles. So albumins is the thickness of plasma and osmotic pressure. Globulins are protective proteins made by lymphocytes, and fibrinogen helps blood clot. And this is a simplified breakdown of blood proteins. It's really worth reading your revision notes on the full detail of what they do. If the lymphatic system is not working effectively, we can have a build-up of edema, which is a build-up of fluid in the body, mostly seen in the feet and hands. It's where tissue becomes swollen, like if you're on your feet all day, and it looks puffy and sore, really. Next is the respiratory system. You should know how to label the respiratory system and the pathway that air would take from entering the nasal cavity and the mouth all the way down to the alveoli. There might be something on the respiratory system on inhalation and exhalation. I always suggest if you get stuck in the exam and you can't think what your body physiologically does when you breathe in, is to sit there and take a very deep breath in. See what happens to your rib cage. Think about what would need to happen to that diaphragm for more air to enter, so you need to lower. You need to think about those intercostal muscles, the muscles in between your ribs, helping it to, when you breathe in, to rise up, and it also expands out to get more air in. And then the complete opposite happens when we exhale. So if you get stuck in the exam, sit there and breathe deeply. Now going to move to gaseous exchange. Now I do think this will appear in the exam because we haven't had it for a couple of exams, so it's quite likely to come up. So please make sure you revise this. You need to know that that it occurs in the alveoli. You need to know about the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and you really need to almost come up with an answer ready in your revision notes for how you would answer this question. To refresh your memory, here is a picture of the alveoli. If you need to stop and pause and have a look at it, please do. I'm now just going to give you a few examples of what you might get asked in the exam. Some of the questions that you could get asked, for example, the respiratory system, is to explain the process of inspiration and expiration. Explain gaseous exchange. Explain how air enters the body and then leaves the body. It obviously more technical than that, but you get the idea. So quickly going to go through the main parts of the respiratory system, and we have here the epiglottis, and this is a flap of cartilage behind the root of the tongue which is depressed during swallowing to cover the opening of the windpipe. Now this usually is associated more with the digestive system. Once the air has come in through our nasal cavity and our mouth, it will then travel through the tube leading from the pharynx, which is the throat, to the lungs, via the trachea, which is the long tube with rings on it going down, labelled on this diagram. The trachea then leads into bronchi. They go either sides. They branch off into two places, one into one lung, one is left hand side of the lung, one into the right hand side of the lung. So the bronchi, trachea to bronchi, either side. As you may notice, we are moving very quickly onwards and going on to the next one, which is cellular respiration. I'm just going over the main points at the moment just to refresh your memory. It doesn't cover everything in depth. Basically, we need to respire in order to release energy, to fuel our bodies, to keep us moving. Respiration can be aerobic or anaerobic. You should know what ATP is, and that it's a high energy molecule, and it's the energy currency of the body. It has a job to supply the cell with energy that it needs. If you get an exam on respiration, cellular respiration, and the worst, your mind goes blank, try to think of, just to get those couple of marks, by saying what is aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration requires oxygen, and anaerobic respiration does not require any oxygen. So if you struggle, at least get those points down. Try to remember that aerobic respiration requires oxygen and glucose, and it produces waste of carbon dioxide and water, as well as actually providing energy. Here is the equation for aerobic respiration. Please feel free to stop the PowerPoint and have a look. For short periods of time, we can have respiration where we don't require oxygen, but this is for very short, brief periods of time, such as an 80-meter sprint, or where we are running for our lives, where we need to get away to safety. So this is without oxygen. So here is a quick, brief diagram of the equation for anaerobic respiration, so without oxygen. You should be aware of the malfunctions of the respiratory system. For example, asthma. You need to know that it is the irritation of the airwaves, and that causes it to narrow. You need to think about some of the triggers that can cause asthma, and obviously avoiding those triggers would help. You need to know about different types of inhalers, relievers and preventers. You might need to know about the peak flow meters, so that's how it's monitored to figure out whether it's getting worse or it's improving. We then move on to emphysema, so respiratory malfunctions, emphysema, which is a condition within a group of respiratory illnesses. It's coronary, it's a type of lung disease. It's caused by smoking, and once you get it, that's it. It's the alveoli are destroyed. There is no magic cure. There is no medication to make it all better. There is medication to stabilize it and prevent it from getting worse, but if you smoke, it will continue to get worse. So it is damages the alveoli and smaller terminal bronchioles. We then move on to the respiratory malfunctions, which is cystic fibrosis. So that's the thick, sticky mucus that builds up in the lungs. You need to be aware that they will need to take medication before they eat, as they may have a sensitive digestive tract. You need to be aware that they may have to have physiotherapy to help them cough up the phlegm that they have. They may need inhalers to help their breathing, but it is a defective gene that is passed on, and that's why that child will end up with cystic fibrosis. It is life-limiting, but there is new medication that's being provided on the NHS, which is hoping to increase the lifespan of somebody that has cystic fibrosis. As I suggested previously, there are peak flow meters to check the breathing rates, physiotherapy, You can also have spirometry, which is a test to check the breathing capacity of lungs, MRI and CT scans, and then there's inhalers, as I've discussed, antibiotics for infections, because someone that has cystic fibrosis is more likely to have infection than somebody that hasn't, and steroids to strengthen the airways. Then we move on to the digestive system. So the oral cavity, tongue, teeth, salivary gland, soft palate, epiglottis, pharynx, esophagus, liver, gallbladder. And for some reason, in great big bold handwriting or letters is the word anus right at the bottom. It's really important that you are aware and can label all these parts of the digestive system. Just to refresh your memory on the epiglottis, so during swallowing, this lowers to block the trachea to stop food or drink from going down into your lungs. A very, very clever piece of kit. We need to know that our stomach is where we store food and that it has hydrochloric acid to kill any microorganisms. And then it has pepsin to begin protein digesting. And it has mucus and bicarbonate ions to protect the stomach from the harsh pepsin and acid. So it actually does a lot to break down our food and also to store it until it's ready to move on. We have our duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, where most of the chemical digestion of fats, proteins and carbohydrates takes place. It releases hormones to tell the pancreas and gallbladder to start working. You need to be aware of the difference between mechanical and chemical digestion. So mechanical digestion first of all occurs in the mouth, and this is where food is physically broken down by our teeth to make it smaller. It's the chewing action that actually gets it to rip and tear those pieces into smaller bits, especially things like meat. And then it sort of like forms into a bolus, which then can be swallowed. However, to be swallowed, you need those salivary glands to be working to help make it moist to be able to swallow. Otherwise, it's a bit too dry to swallow. So we move on to chemical digestion, and within the body we have salivary glands. They produce saliva, and then we have gastric glands within our stomach wall. They produce gastric juice. Liver makes bile. Pancreas produces pancreatic juice. Intestinal glands, small intestine wall, produces intestinal juice. Also in the mouth, the enzyme that's produced is amylase. It's just making sure that these chemicals are helping us to break down and digest our food, and it does start in the mouth. So chemical digestion, when nutrients are broken down by enzymes. So it helps dissolve food. So in the buccal cavity, food is dissolved with saliva that has amylase in it. The stomach mixes foods with enzymes and hydrochloric acid and also churns it. And then you have the chemical digestion of proteins broken down by pepsin in the stomach and the small intestine. Absorption is how the nutrients are extracted from the food are absorbed into the bloodstream, and this occurs in the small intestine. Assimilation. Now this involves the liver. It's the movement of digested food molecules into cells of the body where they're used and become a part of the cells. Excess glucose in the blood reaches the liver and it's converted into glycogen, and that can be stored or broken down and used through respiration. The liver is where toxins such as alcohol are also broken down. Looking at the digestive system, the malfunctions could be irritable bowel syndrome. Irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, affects the large intestine, and it can mean that you're cramping, stomachs, abdominal pain, bloating, gas, which is farting, diarrhea, and constipation, or even all of that. It's a chronic condition that you'll need to manage long term. So chronic means a long-term condition. Other conditions associated with the digestive system are celiac disease. And this can cause indigestion, stomach pains. It's an autoimmune condition, which means the body is attacking itself. It can be genetic, so it can be passed down by parents, family members. It can be monitored with an ultrasound. Must make sure you're aware of what an ultrasound does. A gastroscopy, make sure again that you know what that does. And treatment could be including giving up gluten or ensure that you're vaccinated. Gallstones, similar type of symptoms, abdominal pain, sweating, jaundice. If you have a lot of bilirubin in your system, this can actually cause the stones, and active monitoring can be, you could have an ultrasound to see what's there first of all, but also to remove gallbladder with surgery. We now move on to the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is the control centre for the body. It's the brain and the spinal cord. That is the part of the central nervous system. Peripheral vision is the outside vision you have. So try to think of peripheral vision and peripheral nerves in the same sense, that it's the nerves outside of the central nervous system which make up the peripheral nervous system. So it relays information from the brain and spinal cord to the rest of the body, and the reverse information from the body to the brain. If you have a quick look at this, you'll be able to see where some of the peripheral nerves are. Peripheral nerves include autonomic, which means automatic basically, sensory, which means they're attached to your senses such as touch, taste, smell, and hearing, and then you have motor nerves, which is your muscles, is how they respond to your muscles. So a little bit more on the autonomic system. It's where we're not actually thinking about, it's something that's automatic and it's not controlled, and we don't have to think about it happening. For example, our heart beating or us breathing, or even our gut movements. We don't actually think about them, they just automatically happen. Now move on to nerves. We have cells called neurons, which make up our nervous system. Nerves are specialized cells. They carry messages from one part of the body to another. It's really important to remember this, and the fact that messages are also known as impulses. Understand that the spinal cord transmits information to and from the brain through structures called nerves. As I discussed previously, sensory nerves transmit information from the senses, the eyes, the ears, to the brain. They detect pain, touch and sound. And motor nerves transmit information to the muscles from the brain. They allow the brain to stimulate muscle contraction by carrying the signals to the muscles. We now move on to the structure and function of the brain. Please ensure you stop the PowerPoint to have a little look at all the different areas of the brain to make sure that you are aware of where they all are, so that if it appears in the exam, you know exactly how to label it. To refresh your memory, the cerebral cortex is the wrinkly outermost layer of the brain, responsible for thinking and processing sensory information. The cerebellum is at the back of the skull. It coordinates and regulates muscle activity, so gross and fine motor skills, and it's also involved in the control of muscles to maintain balance. So if you damage this, it can affect your actual balance. Then you have your frontal lobes, which carry out high-level mental processes such as thinking, decision-making and planning. The corpus callosum is a bridge nerve tissue that connects the two halves of the brain, right and left, and enables communications between the two. We then have our hypothalamus, which is responsible for maintenance of body temperature. The medulla is really important. It works automatically, but it actually is there for to sustain our life. It helps us breathe, swallow, and also helps with our heart rate. We move on to meninges, which are 3 layers of membrane surrounding the brain and the spinal cord. They actually help to provide a barrier to the rest of the body, and it's almost like a form of protection from any infection. Neurons are specialized nerve cells that transmit electrical impulses from one part of the body to the other. Have a look at the arrow to see which area, which direction the message travels from. So dendrites to axon. Axon, way of remembering it is A for away. The synapse is the gap between 2 nerve cells. It's a neurotransmitter chemical is released from one side and triggers the ongoing message to the other side of the gap. Very clever. We now have the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is really glands. The endocrine system is made up of glands that secrete hormones, also called chemical messengers. So you may find hormones, also called chemical messengers, that regulate things such as metabolism, reproduction, growth and sleep. You must be able to identify them on a sketch. What is meant by the term hormone? Well, again, I've just said that it's a chemical messenger. That's really important you remember that key point. Hopefully you all remember that the pancreas is a gland situated near the stomach, and this produces the hormone insulin, which is needed to control glucose. Then at the base of the brain, we have the pituitary gland, and this is the gland that regulates and controls all other endocrine glands. It produces 8 hormones: TSH, LH, oxytocin, ADH, for example. Adrenal glands, there are 2, one on top of each kidney. Now, the way to remember it is adrenal, adrenaline. So they produce adrenaline, the fight or flight hormone. So if someone comes towards us with a knife, we either decide to fight for our life, or we would run away. And the hormone that helps us whilst this is happening is the adrenaline. We now move on to the thyroid gland, and this is located in the lower front part of the neck. Now, it's quite, again, like the previous slide, thyroid produces thyroxine, and that's quite an easy way to try to remember it because they are very similar. This affects growth, sustains metabolism, and how the body functions. We're now going to look at the structure of the kidney. You have the cortex, which is the outer layer of the kidney, the medulla, the inner region, which actually contains thousands of nephrons. Nephrons are functions are the removal of urea, so waste, and the maintenance of the balance of water levels. Then you have the renal artery, supplies the kidneys with the blood. Renal vein carries blood filtered by the kidney away. The calyx, which are chambers through which urine passes. Ureters, tubes that carry the urine from the kidney to the bladder. The bladder, where it stores urine, and urethra, where urine is passed out of the body. So the nephron is the minute or microscopic structural and functional unit of the kidney. It's a nephron is used to separate water, ions, and small molecules from the blood. Here is a quick diagram of the kidney nephron. It does look a little bit phallic in its looks. So, functions of the kidney. What on earth are their purpose? They maintain our body's water balance, so osmoregulation, by controlling the water concentration of the blood plasma. This keeps the water input from drinking fluids and water loss constant. We don't want to fill up with water and not be able to get rid of it. It also controls the salt levels and the excretion of urea. Regulates blood pressure, and it also blood volume. Here are the functions of the kidneys simplified. Blood enters the kidneys through an artery in the heart. Blood is cleaned by passing through millions of tiny blood filters. Waste materials pass through the ureter and stored in the bladder as urine. Newly cleaned blood returns to the bloodstream by way of veins. Bladder becomes full and urine passes out the body through the urethra. The kidneys perform their life-sustaining job of filtering and returning to the bloodstream about 200 quarts of fluid every 24 hours. If the body does not do the job well, then it increases the amount of toxins in your body and can make you exceptionally ill. You should know how the kidneys regulate water levels. The kidneys can adjust the concentration of the urine to reflect the body's water needs. So you may notice that when you are dehydrated, your urine may be more yellow or brown in colour compared to when you have drunk lots, in which case it may be more clear. And that's a good way of identifying whether you're dehydrated or not. ADH is a hormone that helps the body to retain water by increasing the water reabsorption by the kidneys. It's really worth making sure you've got notes on this bit. It has been quite a popular question. So the nephrons, they consist of a ball-formed small capillaries called glomerulus and a small tube called a convoluted tubule. So you have the processes that it does. So there's ultrafiltration. It's when metabolic wastes are separated from the blood and urine if formed, and it occurs in the glomerular capsule, or the Bowman's capsule, which is much easier to say. After filtration, kidneys selectively reabsorb molecules that the body needs. Then you have water and osmoregulation. So as much water as the body needs is reabsorbed by the loop of Henle. The urine transfers to the collecting duct and is carried to the bladder via the ureters. We now move on to the liver, one of the biggest organs in the body. It is the largest internal organ, and it carries out more chemical processes than any other organ in the body as well. So one of the functions is to break down proteins, to break down toxics such as alcohol. It breaks down amino acids for energy as well. So detoxification, the liver converts the ammonia produced by deamination into urea. This was still waste but less toxic. The urea is transported by the blood and removed by the kidney, and the liver breaks down alcohol, removing it from the blood. It also breaks down drugs such as paracetamol. It's a vital organ to have to make sure we haven't got all this toxic liquids in our body. So detoxification, again, liver cells remove poisons like alcohol by breaking them down into harmless components. The liver also produces bile, and as a result of the breakdown of red blood cells, bile is stored in the gallbladder until needed by the digestive system. Bile emulsifies fats during the digestive process, and bile gives colour to our feces. Lovely. The concept of homeostasis. Really make sure that you have revised and know that homeostasis is the maintenance of a constant internal environment. So we have looked at homeostasis in quite a bit of depth. So if you need to stop this and have a little look at the key points, please do. Quick examples of homeostasis is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood, our body temperature, blood sugar levels, and our water content. They all need to make sure that they are constant to avoid our body or us suffering the side effects of it. So in order for us and our body to be able to maintain homeostasis, it's done through effectors and feedback mechanisms. So the effector acts on the impulses from its specific command center, counteracting the change and returning the internal and external cell environment to a balanced state. So with negative feedback, if the body detects that you are hot, then it will find a way to rectify that. So it will bring, it will cause your hairs on your body to lay flat, it causes you to sweat, etc. So it's a way your body reacts to rectify a situation. As I've just said, homeostatic control is achieved through negative feedback mechanisms. So if something at the level of something rises, the control systems reduce it again. With osmoregulation and ADH, the concentration of the blood increases due to the water loss through, for example, sweating. Blood water levels concentration is sensed by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus gets a pituitary gland to release ADH. So the pituitary gland controls blood water concentration, and the pituitary gland produces ADH to help keep it more consistent. Our body controls heat by sensing the temperature changes. Vasodilation, when you're hot, brings more blood close to the surface of the skin to cool it down. Sweat glands release sweat, and evaporation cools the blood. Malfunctions of control regulatory systems. Malfunctions most common in the brain are a stroke. Central nervous system is multiple sclerosis, endocrine is diabetes, kidney is nephrotic syndrome, and cirrhosis of the liver is the final one. A question in the January 2018 paper asked what was the cause of stroke. So it's more likely to be if you're over 65 years of age, if you've got a family history of strokes, if you have a heart arrhythmia that can cause it. Basically, bleeding or hemorrhagic stroke is a degeneration of blood vessels with age because of loss of elasticity. High blood pressure can cause blood vessel to burst in the brain, causing a stroke. Ischemic stroke is blood clot in or around the brain, cuts off oxygen to the brain. It puts pressure on various parts of the brain and nerve tissue is killed. So risk factors such as coronary heart disease, too much stress in life, high fat, high sugar, diet, excess alcohol and obesity can put you at a high risk of suffering from a stroke. So what can you do to prevent a stroke? People that are high risk of stroke are on blood thinners. An example of a blood thinner is warfarin, and it's there to help thin the blood so there's less chance of a clot forming. It's called an anticoagulant. If your cholesterol is too high, you might be given a statin. If you have high blood pressure, you might also be given a beta blocker. These also help with heart arrhythmias. You could be given surgery, a thrombectomy, which removes blood clots and restores blood flow to the brain. Surgical stents to keep the arteries open. And also you might be given a feeding tube if you can't swallow, mobility aids, physiotherapy. And as the advert says, the quicker you catch a stroke and get it dealt with, the more of the person you will save. We now move on to the central nervous system and multiple sclerosis, which is the damage of the myelin sheath, and that was it. Multiple sclerosis means MS, myelin sheath. That's a good way of remembering it. MS. It's an autoimmune disease, which means the body is actually attacking itself, and it attacks the myelin sheath in the brain and or the spinal cord, and it becomes inflamed in patches, disrupts the messages traveling along the nerves. When inflammation clears, scarring is left behind on the scarring is left behind on the myelin sheath. This can lead to permanent damage to the underlying nerves. A previous question in an exam paper was impact on the physical effects on an individual's movement. So you need to have a think about how it would affect them from moving. So they may have difficulty in controlling bladder, plaque on fibres, brain stem may affect balance, so it could cause them to fall over, muscle stiffness and spasms, fatigue could cause difficulty walking, and they may have tremors, etc. Dizziness and vertigo, which are basically the same thing, tend to go hand in hand with this condition as well. So I really would stop this PowerPoint, have a look about the impacts and make a few notes. So how could you help someone that's got MS? So there are drugs to suppress these symptoms and effects. For example, there are steroids to treat relapses. People smoke cannabis to help them cope with the side effects. They might have stem cell treatment, hyperbaric oxygen. However, it isn't a condition that can be cured, and there's only things to actually help support it so it doesn't get as bad as fast. They say gentle exercise can help, a healthy balanced diet, physiotherapy, but ultimately it can't actually be cured, unfortunately. The endocrine system, diabetes. You may be asked for a biological explanation of what diabetes is, and you must know the difference between type 2 and type 1 diabetes. So insulin is a hormone produced by the pancreas, a large gland found behind the stomach. If the insulin controls the body's glucose levels by moving glucose from the blood into the body cell, this is converted into energy. It's where the pancreas is not working effectively and is unable to control the glucose is where you have a problem. So a diabetes is an autoimmune disease. It's where the body's system attacks and destroys the cells that produce insulin. So type 2 diabetes occurs when the body's production of insulin is insufficient. This is usually caused by a poor diet and obesity. Make sure you're aware of what it actually is and the difference between the two. Make sure you've had a look at the different types of insulin pumps that are available and where and how they're attached, or how people are expected to take their blood sugar levels daily before food. And for type 2 type of diabetes, a medication like metformin, which stimulates the pancreas to produce insulin, is often used. So how is diabetes monitored? You have to monitor glucose levels with frequent blood tests. They need to attend diabetic eye screening. Insulin must be injected multiple times a day in type 1 and may be required for type 2. Lots of type 2 diabetics can control it with their diet. Healthy eating and regular exercises is needed to maintain a healthy weight. An example of a question in a past paper is, why should Raoul, age 50, take his diabetes seriously and explain the actions he will need to take to avoiding developing further health problems? So underneath are a list of some of the reasons that he needs to take it seriously. So a sudden or uncontrolled drop of glucose results in somebody going in a coma, which is deadly serious. Varying levels of glucose beyond normal limits results in damage to blood vessels. Blood vessels damage leads to kidney failure and stroke. So you can see, if the simple steps to monitor and keep your diabetes isn't kept under control, it can have very negative consequences. So what steps could he take to improve his diabetes? Well, he could change his diet to low fat. He could monitor his blood glucose levels regularly. He could avoid alcohol, increase exercise, use a chiropodist, wear suitable footwear, and make sure he attends any of his medical appointments and even eye examinations. We now move on to kidney nephrotic syndrome. With nephrotic syndrome, the kidneys are not working properly. It can cause large amounts of protein to leak into the urine. The loss of protein is due to an increase in permeability of the filtering membrane of the kidney, the glomerulus, due to kidney disease. This leads to low protein levels in the blood, which causes water to be drawn into the soft tissues, resulting in edema. It can result it can be a result of kidney damage caused by another condition, for example, diabetes. It can also occur because of certain types of cancers, such as leukemia, and it can actually be an inherited faulty gene. So what is the monitoring and treatment and care needs of somebody that has nephrotic syndrome? And basically antibiotics, they help treat infections. Steroids, these reduces immune responses, and diuretic tablets increase the amount of urine produced. So they're some of the main forms of treatment. We now move on to the liver and psoriasis, which is scarring of the liver. So psoriasis is scarring of the liver caused by the continuous long-term liver damage by alcohol. Scar tissue replaces healthy tissue and prevents the liver working properly, and this can lead to liver failure. And that's really important to remember. You've got to remember as well that someone who has psoriasis should be giving up alcohol. Otherwise, it's going to make their condition worse. So causes: alcohol misuse, long-term infection with hepatitis C, and obesity as well can be a cause. So how do we treat and care for someone who's got psoriasis? Well, there's no actual cure, but it's possible to manage the symptoms and any complications. using antiviral medication. You may be advised to cut down and stop drinking alcohol. You might be asked to lose weight, eat healthier. And if it's really scarred, it can stop functioning, in which case you might actually need a liver transplant. We now move on to the sensory systems, malfunctions, and their impacts on individuals. We firstly move to the human eye anatomy. Make sure you are fully aware of all the different parts of the eye and how to label it. This is a very good diagram here, so it is worth stopping the PowerPoint, having a good look and seeing how much you remember. I think the easiest one to remember is perhaps the optic nerve, the pupil and the iris. It's just refreshing your memory on all the other parts of the eye. If you get a question on how the eye works, this is a really good way to answer it, but obviously you're not going to remember it all, so it's worth taking some notes from this. So light reflects off the object we're looking at. Light rays enter the eye through the cornea at the front of the eye. The light passes through a watery fluid and enters the pupil to reach the lens. The lens can change thickness to bend the light, which will focus it onto the retina and the back of the eye. On the way to the retina, the light passes through a thick, clear fluid called vitreous humor. The light then reaches the back of the eye and hits the retina. The retina translates the light into electrical impulses, which are then carried to the brain by the optic nerve. Finally, the visual cortex of the brain interprets these impulses as what we see. Seriously would stop this, write some notes on this so that if this appears in your exam, you know exactly what you are doing. So the pupil, the black bit of your eye, it's the opening in the center of the iris. It regulates the amount of light that enters the eye. It needs to be round in order to constrict. Constrict is when the pupil size is reduced. So that will reduce with bright light. Dilated, a dilated pupil is an enlarged pupil resulting from contraction from the dilator muscle. It normally occurs in dim illumination. It can also be caused by drugs or a trauma. So the iris is the colourful part of our eye. It's behind the cornea that gives colour to the eye, controls the amount of light entering the eye by varying the size of the pupillary opening. It's like a camera, it affects how much light can get in. So the tear layer is really the first layer of the eye that light strikes. Then we have the vitreous humors or fluids, which is the transparent, colourless gelatin mass that fills the rear 2/3 of the eyeball, which actually helps to give it shape. It has to be clear so light can pass through it, and it has to be there. If we didn't have it there, our eye would be all squishy and it would have no shape and it would collapse. We have the anterior chamber, which is filled with aqueous humor, again clear watery fluid that fills the space between the back surface of the cornea and the front surface of the vitreous, and that helps to give it its shape as well. We have the conjunctiva, which is a thin layer that protects the cornea, and the primary function of the conjunctiva is to keep the front surface of the eye moist and lubricated. So here's a little bit more information on the cornea if you wish to stop it and have a little read. We have the retina, which is a light-sensitive nerve tissue in the eye that converts images from the eye's optical system into electrical impulses that are sent along the optic nerve to the brain to interpret as vision. The macula detects light and sends signals to the brain, which interprets them as images. We have ciliary muscles and suspensory ligaments. So a ciliary muscle enables a lens to change shape for focusing. It contracts to stretch the lens, making it flatter and thinner. Then we have the suspensory ligaments, which attach the lens to the ciliary muscle. The optic nerve is the largest sensory nerve of the eye. Carries impulses for sight from the retina to the brain. Really important to remember that. It's to transfer visual information from the retina to the areas of the brain via electrical impulses. The lens is a natural lens of the eye. It's transparent and it's tissue that helps bring rays of light to focus on the retina. It bends light, but not as much as the cornea. So the sclera is the opaque, so it's a clear, fibrous, tough, protective outer layer of the eye. The white of the eye, that's directly continuous with the cornea in front, with the sheath covering the optic nerve behind. It provides protection and helps the eye to form its shape. Example of exam questions could be, describe one function for each of the following structures found in the eye: the humors and the iris. So hopefully by looking at this PowerPoint, you could go, right, I know exactly what I would put for these two here. And let's see if you're right. For example, the humors supports eye, feeds eye, distributes nutrients, helps refract light, protects eye, retina from shock. The iris regulates the amount of light entering the eye, controls light passing through the pupil. Lastly, we move on to the ear, and we need to know how to label a diagram of the ear, understand the function of the ear, common causes and symptoms of the conditions of the ear, monitoring and treatment and care of these malfunctions of the ear, and lifestyle changes that need to be made due to these conditions. Here is some basic ear labeling if you want to stop the PowerPoint and have a go at putting the images in the top right box into where they belong. So with the ear, it's split into the outer ear, middle ear and inner ear. So we'll focus on the outer ear first, which includes the auricle, which is cartilage covered by skin on opposite ends of the head, the auditory canal, also called the ear canal, and the eardrum, the outer ear. Also the pinna is called the flappy bits of your ear. So the outer part of the ear is like a funnel, and you can easily sort of see by the shape of it that it's there to actually help to gather and trap sound waves around us. The middle ear contains 3 tiny bones known as the ossicles, the malleus, incus and stapes. If you've looked at the video that I asked you to on Teams, you'll be able to see how this effectively works together. They're also referred to as a hammer, anvil and stirrup, and actually you can see that quite clearly by their looks. Whereas the outer ear has captured the sound, the middle ear main job is to take those sound waves and turn them into vibrations that are then delivered to the inner ear. But in order to do this, you need the eardrum. The eardrum needs to vibrate, air pressure on the outside and middle ear need to be the same for proper vibrations to take place. Then we have the inner ear, which includes the cochlea, eustachian tube, round window, auditory or cochlear nerve, and semicircular canals. Again, they're quite easily recognisable because they are similar. They look like, so a round window looks round, a cochlea, well, it actually looks like a snout, and semicircular canals look semicircular. So we have the eardrum, which is really like the middle part of the ear, and it's a thin layer of tissue that receives sound vibrations. And transmits them to middle ear cavity. Sound waves travel through the ear canal to reach the eardrum. The eardrum is a thin flap of skin that's stretched tight like a drum. Then the stapes, incus and malleus ear bones will, or also known as stirrup, anvil and hammer, will amplify these sounds made by the eardrum. And then the vibrations are sent across to the cochlea or the snail. So here is the cochlea, the snail-looking creature. It contains jelly-like fluid in a coiled tube. And vibrations pass through the fluids and are converted to neural messages and pass to the brain via the auditory nerve. Within the cochlea is the organ of Corti, and this is basically the body's microphone. It's lined with rows of hair cells that actually help to convert sound vibrations and nerve impulses. We move on to the eustachian tube, which is a canal that connects the middle ear to the upper throat and the back of the nasal cavity. So I discussed the ear's round window earlier and the fact that it looks round, and that's a way of remembering it. And basically it's a second eardrum which vibrates on vibrations entering the inner ear through the oval window. The oval window looks oval in shape. It allows fluids to the cochlea to move, which in turn ensures that the hair cells will be stimulated and that noise will occur. So what's the auditory nerve and what's its purpose? It's a bundle of nerve fibres that carries hearing information between the cochlea and the brain. So what do the semicircular canals do? They're part of the inner ear. They're lined with microscopic hairs and filled with a liquid substance. Every time the head moves, the liquid moves over the sense of hairs. This works as a type of motion sensor as the movements of the cilia are communicated to the brain. Within the ear, we have the ampulla, but this has nothing to do with hearing. It's lined with cilia, and as the movement of the cilia are communicated to the brain, they work as a kind of motion sensor. So they are there to help you maintain your balance. It's worth actually stopping the PowerPoint here to have a look at the different types of hearing loss. So you could have it caused by earwax, perforated or a burst eardrum, an ear infection, and then you can actually have a look at the causes, effect and treatment required for each of these 3 conditions. Many ears disease, glue ear, osmoregulation, they are all worth having a look at, and the causes and the treatments too. And have a brief look at them. So what sort of treatments are there for hearing loss? There are hearing aids. There's several types of different hearing aids. You can have implants, devices that are attached to your skull, placed deep inside your ear. And there are obviously different ways of communicating, such as sign language or lip reading. So hearing aids are electronic devices worn in your ear to make you hear things louder and clearer. And you can have NHS hearing aids, or you can pay privately. I will get you to pause the PowerPoint here as well to have a look at the different types of hearing aids. But basically, it's behind the ear hearing aids, in the ear hearing aids, the canal in the canal hearing aids, and it's important to make sure you're aware of the different types. We move on to the final slide, which is looking at different types of hearing implants, such as bone-anchored hearing aids and cochlear implants. So basically, a bone-anchored hearing aid might be good if you have hearing loss caused by sound, unable to reach your inner ear. Cochlear implants could be if you have severe permanent hearing loss, and they can turn sound into electrical signals to send them to the cochlea. Make sure you're aware of all the different types, because you don't know what you're going to get asked about. Now, this is the final slide. I have rushed through this. I have tried to go through all of the systems in the anatomy and physiology spec and some of the malfunctions. It is quite brief, so you'll have to do your own research, but it might be quite good just to listen to this and refresh your memory of these areas. Think about which areas you're not strong on, go back and revise and make notes on those areas. Good luck for your exam.